everyone, David Emerson from SolCyber here. I am the CTO at SolCyber, and today we have with us Spencer Parker, CPO at iVerify. iVerify is a cornerstone of our mobile offering, mobile security offering. It's an offering that we've brought into the foundational offering more recently, intended to not only protect executives, who work generally on iPads and iPhones. It's something that we found was simply not covered by the more client-focused laptop, desktop, workstation coverage of the foundational coverage package, but also the proliferation of mobile devices broadly as client devices in the enterprise. And so Spencer's here to talk through some of the features and fixtures of that application, which really has been invaluable not only in broadening the scope of our foundational coverage and an optional coverage added to other packages within our portfolio, but also in further securing our customers. So Spencer, take it away.
Thanks, David. So hello, everybody. As David said, I'm Spencer Parker, Chief Product Officer here at iVerify. And, we don't want to bore you just with a product demo today. We actually wanted to share information with you around what we are perceiving to be the latest threats to mobile devices out there, particularly in the iOS space. Everybody knows that Android has had a malware problem since its inception. And, analyzing APKs is still the way to do this. And of course, we do that as well. But up until iVerify, there really was very little chance of people being actively able to detect malware on iOS devices, whether they be phones or iPads. And iVerify brings its unique capabilities to this and allows us to really use a combination of digital forensics and EDR techniques to be able to detect what was previously undetectable on these phones. And we're going to share how we do that, but also take a look at the space right now. So I'm going to share my screen and share the presentation, and we shall begin. Okay. So as Dave mentioned, I come from iVerify. We are the world's first mobile threat hunting platform, and this especially around iOS, which is where we started, and we've added Android in the last year as well, so we can cover all your bases in terms of mobile. But we want to talk really about what are the threats out there. iOS is, quite possibly the most secure operating system you have in your hand every day. But that doesn't mean it is totally secure. And there are various pieces, especially of mercenary spyware out there, that can affect those devices and can target users and very stealthily remove data, voice calls, stream GPS location, do pretty much anything it wants to on those devices and turn them into the ability to remove that data from where they need to. And we want to make sure that we can detect that. We want to make sure that these devices are treated just like any other compute device that you have in your network, where you would have, some sort of EDR type platform running on those. We want the same to happen here. And this really has become a national security issue. We looked at the sort of mercenary spyware industry, the likes of NSO Group with Pegasus, Intelexa Citrox with Predator, more recently Paragon with its Graphite piece of spyware. And we are seeing things in the press about the misuse of those types of tools now on an almost weekly basis. I mean, the interesting thing here is, should this type of mercenary spyware exist? Our view is absolutely it should. I mean, law enforcement should be able to get access to these types of devices and do what they need to do in legitimate, ways that follow the laws of the country. But it's that misuse that we see on such a regular basis. And in the past, it's targeted, a lot of journalists, NGOs, etc. And that has caused major issues. We've also started to see nation states get involved in this as well. The various APT vendors out there are judiciously reusing the exploit chains of the mercenary spyware to create their own exploits and their own pieces of malware that get on these phones and do exactly the same things as the likes of Predator and Pegasus. And do we even have the tools necessary to detect this stuff, let alone be able to counter nation-state mobile exploitation? And this is a major problem which needs to be dealt with at the highest levels of government. Because what we see today is mobile exploitation is nearing the sophistication of desktop attacks. In fact, in some cases, it probably goes way further in sophistication than that of desktop malware. And I say that because most desktop malware requires a single exploit to get on, especially a zero-click type exploit to get on a device. Whereas exploit chains, often 8 to 15 different exploits chained together, are required on an iOS device for them to get root access to the phone and install their payload and then do what they need to do. So this stuff is starting to get very sophisticated, and not only that, very difficult to detect. Because the reality here is Apple has not given tools like iVerify the access that we would need to do this easily. So we're having to look at this in a very different way that a traditional EDR player, for instance, would look at how you detect malware. So we are combining the digital forensics world with the ease of use of the EDR world in what we're doing here, allowing us to gain the forensic data that we need to detect this malware, while still maintaining the privacy of the end users. So we're only looking at OS telemetry. We're not looking at file system telemetry or content that is created by the end user. And one of the most prolific vendors in this space is the NSO Group. NSO Group created Pegasus, probably the most infamous of all of this mercenary spyware. We call NSO Group, it's one of our adversaries that we term Rainbow Ronin. Ronins are our mercenary spyware adversaries. In the case here, Rainbow Ronin is used because of Rainbow Dash from My Little Pony. You can tell here I came from CrowdStrike. The naming of adversaries is very critical. That they have a funny element to them. You do not want people to believe that these adversaries are superhuman, that you're fighting superhumans or anything like that. So you have to stay away from that type of naming. You have to give it a little bit of ridiculousness to be able to psychologically feel like you have an upper hand over these adversaries. And they've been around since 2011 and have changed and evolved with the changing landscape of iOS security. And they've adapted that tradecraft around what the mobile security industry has done to make sure that they continue to have a viable product in this space. We know that it's been misused, though. We've seen plans and intentions of the EU Parliament. We've seen them geolocate political enemies in GCC. We've seen them steal intellectual property from Facebook, suppress victims of military action in Mexico. We've seen them target the French President Macron. So we know that this tool is out there and being used. In fact, it's been used by over 55 different governments around the world. Not all misuse. There are many of these governments have used it for law enforcement purposes, tracking down drugs cartels, those sorts of things, which we absolutely believe there is a legitimate use of this software for. But there's been many illegitimate uses of it too. And I mentioned that these guys are always innovating. In 2016, we saw their Trident build, and it leveraged the first remote one-click and was discovered by Citizen Lab, a Canadian outfit, after a journalist exposed the infection URL itself over Twitter. In 2021, they had two different builds called Kismet and Forced Entry. And forced entry was later identified to be one of the most technically sophisticated exploits by Google's Project Zero they'd ever seen. You know, this was now at the level that was previously only thought that a few nation states may possess. But it didn't stop there. You know, Apple themselves, you know, re-architected iOS to try and deal with this problem, and created the blast door, which, you know, it was supposed to stop this type of behavior. And in 2023, there was, you know, 4 more images here, including a complete blast door bypass called BlastPass that enabled and proved capable of enacting a full system compromise with 0 click. This meant that, you know, they literally could send, for instance, an iMessage to you, which you never saw, and it would infect the phone and would be then silent on that phone whilst it did whatever the remote operator told it to do. All they needed was your phone number or an Apple ID to get on that device. That's it. And they continue to innovate today. Now, one of the really interesting things about forced entry was that this essentially was an attack against the JBig2 codec. And it created an image which essentially emulated a complete computer in that image. It had about 70,000 segment commands, which were equivalent to logic gates in it, and created a small form computer that was capable of the sandbox escape and generically using Objective-C objects between sandbox boundaries. Once you've escaped the sandbox like that with root access, that phone is yours. And this was one of the most advanced attacks that anybody had ever seen against the device. To basically recreate a complete computer through an image on a device was unheard of before this. So something elegant, something that worked, and something that gave them complete control over your device. And then BlastPass came out. I'm not really going to go into this one in too much detail again. There are many different papers now published on this. You can listen on YouTube if you search for Matthias Freisendorf, who's VP of Research here at iVerify. You can see various presentations that he's done, for instance, at Objective by the Sea, where we go through this in great detail around how this works and how, you know, this essentially was a multi-stage attack. One of the really interesting things we found in this exploit, though, was we found that, for instance, Apple will only log 25 crashes of a process. And so what a lot of these exploits were doing was that they would find a generic exploit that would crash the process, crash that process 25 times, and then they would use their exploit for the 26th time to crash and then move to the next stage. This meant that nothing was logged about that exploit, apart from the 25 generic crashes. So you couldn't even see how they were crashing the machine if you just looked at the crash logs of the system. Now, fortunately, there were other logs that, you know, we can dive into some more detail on, but from crash logs alone, it was not enough. And eventually, this gained access past the blast door, and using NS expressions, which then decrypted a payload, which essentially then ran in memory and gave the remote user complete control over that device. So there's a lot of different ways that people have exploited iPhones over the years. Another one of these is Intelexa or Cytrox. This was sort of an Israeli company that moved into Europe, and it became Europe's response to NSA. Again, very heavy on the R&D side of things, put together their own exploit chains. Seem to be a little more happy to work with actors that maybe weren't quite so legitimate. They had good validation of targets with more advanced OPSEC, but we've seen congressmen be attacked with this, US dual citizens, the former Taiwan president, and the president of the EU Parliament, Roberta Metsola, was also targeted with this as well. It basically got into the hands of a third party who then used it to attack the EU Parliament. Again, this is all known stuff. This is, you can search for blogs on this and find out more information about these types of attacks. These implants themselves did some really interesting target validation. First of all, they would look for processes running from private var temp. Why would they do that? Because nothing is supposed to run from there. But what does run from there is malicious spyware. So first of all, they're looking to see, is any other spyware installed on this phone? Could Pegasus be installed on this phone? They also check for log monitoring. Various system configuration plists and kernel monitors can be set to identify changes. They didn't want that set because they would be easily found if that was there. They're checking location and validating country code on the device to make sure it is attacking who they say they are. They also wanted to see if developer mode was enabled, and if it was, they wouldn't install. Because developer mode could mean that there was other things running on that device that they didn't want there. Again, same with active jailbreaks. If the device was jailbroken, they would terminate. They didn't want to be on a jailbroken device because anything could be installed on that, which could mean that their payload itself was captured. And one of the things that we do is we want to be able to work out those exploit chains and the payloads, because we want to be able to go straight to Apple with these things. So they patch the flaw. Patching that flaw and burning that exploit that might have cost this company $20 million to create is the single fastest thing we can do to protect users. So we're looking at that. They're checking for unsafe processes like network analysis utilities, PCAPs, those types of things. Also looking for proxies and man-in-the-middle solutions and enterprise VPNs that could be, taking their data and analyzing it off-box, with network-based analysis. And also looking for additional root certificates being added that could do HTTPS decryption, for instance. Because all of this stuff could give away that Predator was on this device. So assuming that it passed all these checks, it would then install. So it meant that, they didn't burn their exploits anywhere near as quickly as they had in the past. And there was a pretty low barrier to entry here. I mean, often, Intellectual would be working with the telecommunications infrastructure. It gave them a lot lower exploitation costs because the spyware injection middle box was actually inside the telco, inside a trusted network. So, this meant that they had a much higher success rate of infection. Today, we hear a lot about Scattered Spider. Now, Scattered Spider is not somebody that has a piece of mercenary spyware. They don't need it. They are highly sophisticated social engineering people that will use SIM swapping and smishing, essentially, to live off the land. We've seen them use, start at the mobile device in things like the MGM ransomware attack, Caesars Entertainment ransomware, and compromise of multiple major US banks doing this. And smishing is still the most common problem that you're going to face on these devices. And one of the reasons why smishing gets through is that often people are using the same smishing technology or anti-phishing technology that they're using on their email on their phone. So using the same detection engine in both places. So if it gets through one of them, it's going to get through both of them. So strength and depth here is very critical. And we know that phones can be used to move laterally, whether it's credential and token theft, various other attacks to compromise that employee and get their credentials. Once those credentials are stolen, then, it's game over. Corporate services are accessed, lateral movement happens, ransomware is deployed, stuff is stolen, and then, all hell breaks loose. Probably the last one to talk about is triangulation. triangulation, leaked with a lot of other US military secrets a few years back. And this was found targeting, for instance, Kaspersky, although the intentions there were unclear. It is an offensive implant, and it is a very modular fileless Mach-O binaries that receive execution in memory. There are tons of undocumented features within the device's SOC that it was exploiting. And although this is a legacy binary that no longer can be used on modern iOS, there is a re-exploitation potential of its targets and a compromised validator there. I mean, it really was the coming of age for mobile malware. Had C2 infrastructure, as you'd expect. It had over 24 commands that it could run, designed to upload, download, create and modification of files, listing and terminating processes, dumping credentials, monitoring the device's geolocation without geolocation services even being enabled. And then a lot of features commonly seen with post-exploitation frameworks as well. You could sleep the implant for a duration of time, you could uninstall or destroy the implant, change runtime configuration parameters, using symmetric cryptography to protect payloads. You know, it was a very, very elegant piece of malware. So that gives you an idea of the sorts of threats that we face today on iOS. And there are 4 or 5 major mercenary spyware vendors out there, and probably about 50 other vendors that are more country specific, that have either exploit chains or parts of exploit chains. And there's a whole sort of access broker thing built up around these exploits now. So there's a marketplace to go buy various exploits that you can chain together, so you don't have to spend that $20 million yourself anymore. You can just go and spend a few million buying these exploits up and chaining them together to get what you need. So what trends are we seeing out there? Now this is this came from Google. They've actually published a newer report very recently that has the 2024 numbers in there. And Apple iOS accounted for 80% of zero-day vulnerabilities discovered by Google under active exploitation in 2022. 80%. So we all know the tens or it could be hundreds of thousands of CVEs that are generated. But these look at the actual CVEs that were exploited in the wild, analyzed, and ultimately fixed by Apple as well. This is just the ones that Google found. There are going to be many more that Google didn't find as well. May have been found by other threat groups, but it's way higher actually than Android. Android doesn't need that many exploits to be attacked, because Android allows you to install an APK from anywhere you like. And if they're using social engineering to trick you to install that APK, all bets are off. This is why Android does still have a malware problem, even though they've done a really good job at cleaning up that malware from the Play Store and things like that. So many people, especially in Asia Pacific, sideloading is just another way of installing data. And the types of iOS remote attack surface, it's still pretty expansive. I mean, the types of attack surfaces that we see are really the core Apple services on the device. So iMessage, HomeKit, Find My, WebKit, PassKit, Image.io, Messenger, Instagram, WebRTC, WhatsApp, Signal. We've seen all of these be attacked. And, so some of those are, core Apple iOS features. Some of those are obviously third-party apps, but they will always be ripe for exploitation. Now, Apple does a particularly good job at patching these things quickly when they find these issues, way faster actually than most vendors. And because iOS itself, people are in that good cadence of updating with security patches and things like that, much better than Android users are, and that's assuming you get access to the security patches on Android. So if you're Pixel and Samsung, you're usually fine. Everybody else, all bets are off, quite frankly. So all of this stuff needs rapid patching when something is being actively exploited. As I said, One of the quickest ways that iVerify can protect end users is to share that information with Apple and get that thing patched very quickly and burn that exploit. So that is very much part of our mission. And we see an emerging ecosystem, as I mentioned, out there to regularly reuse variants of these CSV exploit chains. I mean, we have seen very recently some of the Chinese nation state spyware that is out there use an exact replica of the exploit chain that Pegasus uses. Now, how they got that, whether they bought it directly from NSO Group or whether they stole it, it's more likely it was stolen. We see this stuff very regularly happen. And Russia is the same. We've seen Iran with the kittens do the same thing in Iran as well. Although they're more likely their own exploits. So this is not just a mercenary spyware problem now. This is a nation state problem too. So if you as a company has ever been attacked by a nation state, your mobiles are just as much of a target now as your desktops. And one of the things that, we always sort of talk about and think, what would happen if somebody did successfully hack NSO? It would create, if that source code was leaked, it would give the exploit chain and the payload to a nation state to do with as they will. The way that NSO Group sells the Pegasus package today is that you are getting access to it, but it's the NSO Group users are the ones actively doing the exploitation and running those commands for you and doing things like that. Imagine you had all of those handcuffs taken away from you. It would be really, really dangerous. Something that mass infected tens of millions of iPhones is not out of the question in that scenario. And this would not only target senior execs, this is going to target all your key personnel, your general population, all sorts of different people. And at nation state levels, they are able to take all of that data off those devices and actually ingest all of that and do with it as they will. So data storage is not a problem for them. So having all of that data uploaded to the cloud, most of it probably is useless rubbish to them, but they will find in there critical things. We know a lot of end users, use notes, for instance, on their iPhone now to store their passwords. Absolutely ridiculous that they do this, but they do. It's the digital post-it note solution for passwords. This is why you really should use a password manager. But they still use that, and if you got access to that, that would be a major problem. So we are completely unprepared to counter this mobile exploitation. Apple doesn't want you to. Apple is a very, very secure operating system, but it's still security through marketing. If we've drunk the Kool-Aid and, most of us have deployed iPhones and iPads as standard, we have minimized a lot of our problems, but they haven't gone away. They are there, and we know it only takes one device to get hacked for it to be game over. So who's been out there and sort of successfully detected mobile spyware? Well, the top three, that are interesting. Amnesty International, Citizen Lab. These are looking, specifically at civil society. And when you only look in one place, you think it's a problem only in one place. It isn't. It is a major problem there, absolutely. NGOs, journalists, etc. But when you start looking elsewhere, you start finding it everywhere. And this is where iVerify comes in. Google's tag group has done a superb job of analyzing this data and publishing on it, and still do to this day. There was another vendor called Zecops that did do a fairly similar thing to iVerify, got bought by Jamf, But an Israeli company that after they got bought by Jant, many people left the company, and those that didn't got pulled into the Gaza war through the IDF. So have not really done much since that acquisition. And when you don't really do much for almost 2 years, you start to lose ground to your competitors, being iVerify being the only other competitor out there. And we now have many, many more detections and capabilities than ZecOps did. So what is actually required to detect spyware on iOS? And here's a couple of there's 6 known problems here on iOS. There was only one of these that could actually get from the app data, and that was Hermit, because it was an app that installed. So this is probably the only one that, if you took the Android approach and did it and replicated that on iOS, this is probably the only one you would have found. Crash logs, there's Pegasus in there. Files at certain stages, Pegasus have been in there. Rain, Predator, Poison Carp, etc. We can find that. The interesting thing is we can find files on the operating system, even though we're still in the sandbox. Our app is signed off by Apple. It's in the App Store. There is, we're not doing anything we're not supposed to be doing here. We're not jailbreaking the device or utilizing any APIs that we're not supposed to and things like that. So, but we have worked out ways of doing things that have been successful here. Network, often there's IOCs for C2s and things like that on these devices that you have a chance of catching there. But the thing that you really need to look at is process data. And process data has been very, very difficult to find on these devices. Again, we have a way of doing that now. And we have an ability to detect processes and process metadata and all of that type of thing on these iOS devices through our agent. So when you look at how that data is collected, so the traditional MDM plus MTD approach, there's Imperium or Lookouts, those types of vendors. They can do some file stuff, they can do some network stuff, but that's it. And that will not find modern malware, especially mercenary spyware, at all on iOS devices. You need to be looking into the forensic files, the OS forensics, the diagnostics, the backups, the sysdiagnose files. Now, backups, a little bit contentious. They do contain a lot of PII. This is not something we need off the device to be able to detect mercenary spyware. It's useful to get backups if you want to get a copy of the payload, if you can capture it while it's running. But other than that, we can still, through sysdiagnose, unified logs, and those types of things, Jetsam events, crash logs, all process data, and that hard forensic data. We have built an agent that does this at scale without you needing to be a forensics expert on these devices. So we do the hard work automatically for you. And this flags up suspicious events, unknown events, and known bad events very, very quickly for you. Because forensic analysis itself, if you're using MVT or some of those other tools out there, they take too long. Like MVT takes about 10 to 15 minutes to create a sysdiagnose file, then you've got to upload it, and then you've got to basically a ton of Python scripts looking through that data. iTunes backups that other forensics will look at can take hours before you get access to it, depending on the size and the transfer speed. Network level detections require huge scale to be able to do this, and to find all of the C2s and things like that. But all of these methods require user interaction and expert analysis, which our customers just don't have. So we have to do all of this for them in the product. Typical forensic training out there doesn't include iOS malware analysis. So we provide that for our customers. And forensic experts or organizations that can do the analysis are scarce. There's some very good partners that we have, that are able to do this, but on the whole, you need a system that is doing it for you. You want that threat hunting to be automatic. This shouldn't be something that bogs down your SOC team with millions of lines of log codes to look through and all that type of thing. This needs to be automatic. Now, last thing I'm going to talk to you about is a problem that we call the going dark problem. Now, I've talked about forensics. I've talked about the need to gather in forensics. But if I'm only doing forensics one time, that point in time thing means that we have to have caught this piece of malware at exactly the right point in time. And the chances of that happening are slim to none. We know that threat actors are using zero-click attacks to avoid any user interaction. We also know that threat actors are improving their cleanup techniques. They are deleting log entries in these log files, these forensic OS log files. The interesting thing, of course, is those holes that are basically creating Swiss cheese do leave us evidence to go look for. They leave us patterns of known pieces of malware that, delete certain amounts of data at certain times and things like that. And we know that iOS forensics research and data collection capabilities remain very limited. So say if you've got some basic MVT stuff, you might, if you're a very large customer, be able to afford a Celebrite or a magnet box for doing full file system dumps. But on the whole, you have been basically at Apple's behest around what you can do here. And at the behest of their security, that everything's fine. Often it isn't. We're seeing an infection rate of roughly 1 in 1,000 devices that has something that has happened to that device at some point. So let's give you an example here of a Pegasus attack. So the infiltration attacks HomeKit, which then attacks iMessage, which gives it privilege escalation. Now, as this happens, we get crashes, we get potential traces in log files, we get to detect that exploit chain as it happens. Now, once that code execution happens, the implant, the exfiltration, and the cleanup, that all affects logs, crashes, processes, networks, files. So we have many places that we can look in that OS data to find this stuff before it's cleaned up. And then it will clean itself up and exit the device, and then all of it, and it will delete the log files, and away it goes. So let's look at a Pegasus attack here without cleanup. So these dots represent the forensic traces left behind by Pegasus. And if we look at sysdiagnose, sysdiagnose has various different files in it, some of which may only last 3 hours, some of which may only last 3 days, some of which may only last 3 months, some of which last 7 years. But in this case, we're not seeing anything in that sysdiagnose file, because the sysdiagnose file that had that data, we did not capture it at the right time. If we got a backup of the device, we may have got it. If we look at crash logs, we may have been able to find it. Now with cleanup, all of those little pink squares that are now empty have been deleted. Now we can't see it in the backup anymore. It's not in the crash logs anymore. Still would have been in the sysdiagnose if we'd seen it. So if we can get the sysdiagnose file at the right time, we've got evidence. So how do we get it at the right time? Well, we've got to get this stuff more regularly. We can't just plug a phone in and do it once. This has got to be real-time streaming off the device. We need to get the telemetry off the system as well as these things, and we need to regularly do data collection off the device to maximize the chances of getting that evidence that we need to be able to detect this stuff. That's exactly what our agent does. And that's our approach to detecting spyware. So it's a unified platform. It's a cloud-based product provided through SolCyber that allows you to collect the data that you need. So we're getting the process metadata, we're getting the app list, we're getting the crash logs, we're getting the files. We're doing a little bit of network stuff, but for privacy reasons, we very much limit that. So we have a very highly effective capability to detect anomalies and bad stuff on the system. And we have 4 sort of core threat hunting principles here. We have telemetry collection. You cannot fight what you cannot see. iVerify is the only company in the world that fully collects process metadata in addition to the app lists, crash logs, files, and network data. So if we are seeing that data, we can detect on it. We also, more importantly, have a baseline and sample comparison capability that we call our spyware observatory, and our knowledge base here, that we know on every version of iOS and running on every piece of hardware, because there are differences in in iPhones. They have different chipsets in them, things like that, which means there are different versions of software running in these things. But we know what is known good. So if we know that this file or this process always runs sandboxed, with a PID of 501 or something like that, we know it's sandboxed and it's running properly. That's great. If we suddenly see that same process running unsandboxed with a PID of 0 and it's now running at root, we know that's a problem. We also know that a lot of files that these mercenary spyware vendors use, they call themselves the same name as common Apple processes. So that means that they try and hide in plain sight. But because we can see the process metadata, they can no longer hide from us. We also have that expertise in-house for looking at threat hunting. So part of our solution is to threat hunt for you. We have retained some of the world's most renowned iOS security researchers, both on iOS and Android now as well. And that allows us at scale to be able to threat hunt across all of our customers' data and find things that we've never seen before. And our contextualization means that we can rapidly analyze and contextualize any incoming information from those threat hunts. So that we can then produce both automated and manual analytics there to find these things and find them across multiple users, and then create signatures that we use going forward on those things to be able to find them much more easily and without having to threat hunt on them. So that's our sort of core threat hunting principles. And our process is very simple. We collect data off the device. We do have a privacy document. The SolCyber guys can give you that to show that we are not taking intentionally any PII data off the device. And once we have collected that data, we then enrich that through our spyware observatory and we generate knowledge from that. This is compared against both private IOAs and heuristics and public IOAs and heuristics. And then we throw up detections. The rest of the data is threat hunted on, and then we flag up anything that we find. And then you can consume through our portal that data, and you can push that into your SIMs and do all sorts of interesting stuff with that data. We obviously give you the raw data available to you as well if you want that. And if you need to see access to that data, you can. As I said, we do offer training on iOS threat hunting, which is done by our VP of Research, Mateus. And we regularly do these things. I think we're doing it at Black Hat, we're doing it at Objective by the Sea. So these courses are always full and attended by a lot of the major companies from around the world that want to know more in this space. So how do we solve that going dark problem? Well, basically it's because we collect forensic data very, very frequently, every few minutes. Not only that, we're producing diffs, so once we've done that initial upload of the raw data, then the diffs every few minutes are very, very small. We only upload those diffs over Wi-Fi, so we don't burn through any cellular data. We are exploring as many new data sources as we possibly can. MVT, for instance, really only looks at a few files from sysdiagnose. We look at a lot more data than that. And we build those heuristics and behavioral detections to find this stuff, even if the data's been deleted. Now, the beauty of what we're doing is that often these pieces of spyware are on the device for a minimum of about 15 minutes. So by the time the cleanup happens at the end and they go and delete all this data, and your logs look for that 15 minutes like Swiss cheese, firstly, we now know there's Swiss cheese. Secondly, we've probably got a copy of that log data, so we can see what are they deleting and what is then giving us that really interesting information around the actual data itself. So if we know what they're deleting, we know it's because there's evidence of what they're doing there. So that allows us to look at that data. And that is critical to us. And also the Swiss cheese has a signature. We know that certain pieces of malware delete certain time periods of data in certain files. So again, that creates overall signatures for us. And we also strengthen defenses through sharing and collaboration within the industry. If we held all the data that we knew about just in iVerify, it's not really helping the industry. So we make sure that we have our various back channels to various other research groups, including Apple, to make sure that we are sharing and collaborating as much as we can. There's probably less than 50 researchers in the world that really understand this stuff. So we need to be able to pull on that bigger community than just iVerify to be able to get this stuff looked at and verified as quickly as possible. So with that, I'll hand back across to David now. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Spencer. Wonderful presentation there. And, the thing that we really set out to do with SolCyber was to drive the tools and the techniques that the Fortune 500 have access, into the small, medium, and even large enterprise that just doesn't have a cybersecurity bent or, can't otherwise fund that sort of effort themselves. And that's just, it's exactly what you guys do. This is really the sort of thing that was formerly the domain of a large enterprise or maybe even nation state. And now it's accessible. Now it's available to SolCyber customers as part of foundational coverage. So thank you very much, Spencer.
Thank you for your time. And thank you to everybody for listening.